Red Dead Redemption 2 is chock full with historical connections, and the opening towns of Coulter and Valentine strongly prove that, from the locations themselves and the businesses in it, down to the individual people and the things that they say. But with Leviticus Cornwall and his hired army of Pinkertons hot on the tails of the Van der Linde gang, they make their way to the southern state of Lemoyne, and the historical connections are far from being over. So let's take a look at the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. First things first, let's talk to Dutch.
My daddy died in the field in Pennsylvania, fighting this lot.
Of course, he's referring to the fact that his father fought for the Union in the American Civil War. Being a southern state, an amalgamation of several real southern states, Lemoyne was part of the Confederate States of America, the breakaway state that fought for secession in the Civil War. There were many different field battles in the Civil War, but the Pennsylvania battle that Dutch is referring to is probably the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in July 1863. This battle is often considered the turning point of the Civil War, eventually leading to the victory of the Union Army. However, it wasn't without its casualties. Both armies were said to have lost at least 23,000 soldiers during the battle. Dutch's father was one of them. As Dutch rides away from camp with Arthur and Hosea, he mentions the weather.
It's like I can breathe again, thick and soupy as this air is.
Anyone who lives in the southern United States likely knows how true that is. The South has a reputation for being hot and humid, with long summers and weak winters. This is because most of the southern states fall within the humid subtropical climate zone. The deputy that Arthur meets later speaks about the weather a little more.
We are in dire need of some rain round here, let me tell you.
This close to the city of Saint Denis, the state of Lemoyne is almost certainly taking most of its inspiration from the real state of Louisiana. But Louisiana is certainly not dry. In fact, it's the wettest state in the contiguous US, averaging almost 60 inches of rain and 60 days of thunderstorms per year. That being said, the year 1899 in particular saw several reports regarding a lack of rain throughout the state that negatively impacted the growth of crops. So the deputy's comments have some truth to them. While the city of Saint Denis has its own inspirations that will likely become clear, Rhodes is a little more ambiguous, taking elements from several different southern states. Most notably, the red clay soil that colours the town can be found in several different southern states, most notably Georgia, but also Mississippi, Alabama, North and South Carolina, and Virginia. In addition, however, there are more signs that point to Rhodes, and the entire state of Lemoyne, being fairly heavily influenced by the state of Louisiana, from the plantation houses to the Lemoyne Raiders, and even to the feud between the Braithwaites and the Greys, which the deputy tells you about.
I'm sure you already know of the Braithwaites. They've been fighting with the Greys for as long as I can remember.
This dispute could be inspired by any number of family feuds from the 19th century. The Hatfield-McCoy feud from the West Virginia-Kentucky border is a particularly popular one that has inspired several recreations and adaptations, but it seems more likely that the Braithwaite-Gray dispute is based on the Jones-Liddell feud from Louisiana. Both feuds were fueled by speculation. The Braithwaites and Greys believed that the other had stolen their treasure, while the Joneses blamed the Liddells when one of them was shot in the face. In reality, neither story was true. The family treasure was actually taken by lovers Lucille Braithwaite and Douglas Gray to help finance local groups fighting to end slavery, while the gunshot to the face was from a family friend of the Liddells, though that didn't stop the Joneses from blaming them anyway. The ideologies of the families are similar too. Both the Braithwaites and Greys benefited from slave owning and suffered financially after the war, especially the Braithwaites, who were said to be in debt, while the Greys appear a little better off, owning half the businesses in Rhodes. In real life, Colonel Jones aligned himself with the Union after the war in order to save his property, while the Liddell plantation, in financial ruin, was put up for auction, an auction that even Jones couldn't pass up, beginning negotiations to purchase the property. Ultimately, General Liddell was killed by Colonel Jones and his sons, and in revenge, Jones was killed by a mob who wanted justice, and with that, the feud was over. Regarding the concept of plantation families, these complexes were fairly common in the southern United States from the 17th up to the 20th centuries. They were generally self-sufficient, relying on the forced labor of slaves, which of course was no longer legal after the abolition of slavery in 1865. We'll talk more about these specific complexes featured in the game a little later. There are a few phrases uttered throughout this mission that have some interesting history, one very recent and one not so much.
Well, look what the cat drug in.
This phrase, using the word dragged instead of drug, was first found in print in 1888, 11 years before Dutch uses it here. That being said, informal phrases like this are typically in use much earlier than they first appear in print. Either way, Dutch's usage here is historically fitting.
Come along now. I will keep this fellow on the straight and narrow.
This phrase is much older, being derived from the New Testament verse Matthew 7:14.
But strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it.
Well, we be three poor mariners, newly come from the seas.
This song, performed beautifully here by Arthur Dutch and Hosea, dates back to at least 1609, when it was first recorded in Deuteromelia as a song to entertain King Henry VIII. The lyrics in the game are identical.
Holy boy, come pledge me on this ground.
In one of the chapter's next missions, Arthur explains the gang's alias to Sadie.
And what's this? Return to Tacitus Kilgore.
Oh, that's Dutch's idea. All mail to be sent to the same alias.
Aliases certainly weren't uncommon for outlaws in the Old West. Remember Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? That's Robert Parker and Harry Longabaugh. In fact, Butch Cassidy wasn't the only alias used by Parker. He also went by George Parker, George Cassidy, James Maxwell, James Lowe, Lowe Maxwell, Santiago Lowe, among many others most likely. Considering how useful aliases were for Butch Cassidy, perhaps Dutch had the right idea. On their way back to camp, Arthur and Sadie are confronted by a group who call themselves the Lemoyne Raiders. The group mostly consists of Confederate Army veterans and the reactionary young men who they have recruited. Because of their allegiance to the Confederacy, they remain bitterly opposed to the northern states and continue to hold their deeply racist and anti-government views. There are several neo-Confederate organizations that the Lemoyne Raiders could be based on, but it more than likely takes its history from the White League, a paramilitary group of Confederate veterans in Louisiana. The group, founded in 1874, targeted mostly African Americans, made clear through its affiliation with the KKK, but also whites who supported the Republican Party, and of course, Northerners who supported the Union. The group itself was essentially defunct within 2 years, though unfortunately its ideologies did, and does, live on. The next set of missions, The Course of True Love, properly introduces Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite, two star-crossed lovers from each side of the opposing families, a familiar tale for any fans of William Shakespeare. At the beginning of this mission, we get the first proper look at Caliga Hall, the home of the Grays. This property could be based on any number of plantation houses in the southeast, and it most likely is, with different elements taken from different properties. However, it appears to most closely resemble the Shirley Plantation in Virginia, built in the early 18th century. The land was originally used for growing tobacco, which, as Archibald told us previously and will soon experience up close, is the same operation of the Gray family at Caliga Hall. Of course, the main building at Caliga Hall bears a striking resemblance to the one at Shirley Plantation, but the similarities don't end there. The front gates, specifically the brick pillars, are quite similar, as are the smaller surrounding buildings. At the Shirley Plantation, there's the ice house, kitchen, smokehouse, and farms. The main difference, and it's a pretty minor one, is that the secondary buildings at Caliga Hall are mostly to the side and behind the main one, while at Shirley Plantation they're technically in front. Both plantations back onto a long flowing river too, Caliga Hall to the Kamassa River, and Shirley Plantation to the James River. After speaking with Beau Gray, it's time to take his letter to Penelope Braithwaite, and in doing so, getting a look at Braithwaite Manor. Well, as much as you can see while sneaking around the property, but let's talk about it anyway. Like Caliga Hall, Braithwaite Manor could be based on several different plantation houses, especially those located in Louisiana, but it seems most likely modeled off Oak Alley Plantation, located in Vacherie, Louisiana. The property was founded as the Bon Séjour Plantation in the 1830s to grow sugarcane, a slight difference from Braithwaite Manor, which primarily grows corn, though it used to grow cotton as well. After the Civil War, Oak Alley Plantation was left intact, but the economic disruptions caused by the war and the abolition of slavery left it economically unstable. The same can be said for the Braithwaites, who were impacted economically by abolition. The owner of Oak Alley became severely in debt, and the plantation was sold for $32,800 in 1866. The Braithwaites were a bit more stubborn, becoming severely in debt but refusing to sell. Today, Oak Alley is a historic landmark and remains open for public viewing. In the last part of this mission, Arthur agrees to drive the wagon of a women's suffrage march through the main street of Rhodes. The demand for women's suffrage was a decades-long effort to allow women the right to vote. By 1899, this movement was in full swing, with several associations organizing and attending multiple conventions to argue for the right to vote. While more local, small-scale marches like the one in the game may have occurred, it's typically thought that the first suffrage march in the United States didn't take place until August 1908, 9 years later, with as many as 300 attendees. In any case, the suffrage movement is an integral part of American history, so its inclusion is commendable. Encouragingly, Arthur's participation in the rally isn't entirely historically inaccurate. There were several men around this time who were quite vocal in their support of the women's suffrage movement, including Frederick Douglass, George Francis Train, and William Lloyd Garrison, as well as the larger organization, the Men's League, though their support was much more involved than Arthur's obliviousness as a shotgun messenger. In one of the next missions, Arthur, Dutch, and Bill are temporarily deputized by Sheriff Gray, which is historically accurate as deputies were typically hired by a superior officer like the sheriff. The sheriff, meanwhile, was typically elected to office by residents of the county, while a U.S. Marshal, like the first game's Lee Johnson, were appointed by the city council. In their first outing as deputies, the boys are tasked with shutting down a moonshine distillery. Historically used to refer to clear, unaged whiskey, moonshine was made with corn mash in the United States, which might explain why the Braithwaites are involved. The term moonshine, referring to illicit or smuggled liquor, dates back to 1785 in the United Kingdom. By 1829, this definition had made its way to the southern United States. It apparently derives from the fact that illegal spirits were often made under the cover of moonlight to avoid detection from authorities. The US began taxing liquors and spirits shortly after the American Revolution in 1791. During the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s, moonshiners were often portrayed as heroes defying an oppressive government. After the Civil War in the 1860s, many saw them as violent criminals. On their way out, Dutch makes a snarky comment about Sheriff Gray's alcohol consumption.
And people waste time with the temperance movement. Liquor never dulled a good man's senses.
Of course, the temperance movement was a social campaign against the consumption of alcohol. Small movements originated in the 18th century, but it grew into a mass movement from around the 1860s, and eventually led to the Prohibition movement, which resulted in the ban of alcohol production, transportation, and sale in 1920. During the ride, Archibald gives Arthur a brief history of the Braithwaites and their fortune.
Old Cotton family had a fortune at one point until, well, a few changes in the labor laws.
Of course, by changes in the labor laws, he's referring to the abolition of slavery. The early history of cotton farming in the US is synonymous with the history of slavery, as the massive number of slaves is the primary reason that so much cotton could be farmed. Hot summers and rich soils also made the southern United States ideal for growing cotton. In fact, the cotton industry in the South was so strong that it was used as an attempted political strategy by those in support of seceding the southern states. Of the 15 slave states in the US, the 7 whose economies were based on cotton plantations seceded by 1861 and formed the Confederacy. The other 8 slave states, with little or no cotton production, remained in the Union. On their way to the moonshine distillery, the group encounter a broken, abandoned wagon alongside 2 dead bodies. Archibald identifies one of them.
Frederick Mitchell, Lemoyne State Legislator.
Now, a state legislator is someone who writes and passes laws. In the US, these are members of Congress. Interestingly, one of these members actually died in 1899, Samuel T. Baird, a member of the House of Representatives representing Louisiana's 5th Congressional District. He died from a complication of diseases in Washington, D.C., as opposed to ambush and murder in an open field in Lemoyne, so the events are almost certainly unrelated, but a fascinating connection nonetheless. In one of the next missions, everyone's favorite uncle tells us about a potential job.
It's a supply wagon carrying payroll, but very briefly unguarded, apparently, as it passes through a crossroads near here where there's an old ruined church before it connects with the rest of the wagon train.
Now, you might be familiar with wagon trains, as you've seen the Van der Linde gang use this method as they travel between camps. They're groups of wagons that travel together, often associated with the American West. In the applicable areas, wagons would often fan out and travel further apart to minimize the amount of dust blown onto the wagons behind. Wagon trains were fairly popular around the 1840s to the 1880s, upon which their popularity waned after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. But you can't exactly expect the Van der Linde gang to travel between camps by rail, so their wagon trail makes sense, as does that of the payroll wagon for added security. There are a few more things of interest said throughout this mission. First things first, someone needs to insult Uncle, and Bill takes that honor without hesitation.
I've been getting down to business.
Finding the nearest grog house.
Now, grog originally referred to rum diluted with water. As my fellow Aussies and Kiwis would know though, in Australia and New Zealand today it refers to any alcoholic drink. A grog house then is referring to a pub or a bar, first in use as early as 1810 in England and 1834 in Tennessee, and completely unsurprising that Bill would be familiar with it too.
I've been scoping jobs like this since you fellers were knee-high to a grasshopper.
This specific phrase seems to be the most common today, but it had several alternatives. The earliest recorded version is knee-high to a toad in 1814, though it could also be substituted with mosquito or duck. The earliest verbatim usage of Uncle's version exists in print as early as 1851, when Uncle was a young man, so it's unsurprising that this version is what he stuck with.
Wind.
Soon, Williamson. Christ's sakes.
The timing on this phrase is interesting. In text, for Christ's sake dates back to 1893, though it doesn't clearly appear in text as a vulgar term until 1907. The abbreviation used in the subtitles wasn't until 1934. That being said, any colloquial or vulgar term used around this time likely far predates its first publication, since writers, scholars, and journalists have little reason to be using them in their work. Or perhaps Uncle is just ahead of his time, or more likely from the future. After the mess we made in that mission, we should take things a little easier for a minute by performing some tasks with the folks around camp. Sean's tasks, robbing a homestead and a stagecoach, have a few sayings of note.
He tells me they're a stick-up crew.
The verbal usage of stick-up, meaning to rob someone at gunpoint, is said to have originated in 1846, but a little over 50 years before it's used here. Unsurprising considering the stereotype of the Old West.
You must think I'm such a featherbrain.
The origin of featherbrain is unclear. It's said to have either originated in 1668 or around 1830 to 1840, so quite the difference. Either way though, it makes sense that Mary Beth would be aware of the term. I can't imagine it's very common, but considering the amount of books that she's read, it certainly would have come up once or twice, so her usage makes a lot of sense. At the beginning of the Homestead mission, Sean asks about Arthur's heritage.
Is your people, Jacobites or English lovers, Arthur?
Jacobitism was a complex mix of different ideas, but the most consistent part of the movement was that when the reign of King James, the 2nd of England and the 7th of Scotland, ended, the monarchy of those who followed, starting with the co-reign of his daughter Mary II and her husband William of Orange, was illegitimate, as monarchs were appointed by God or divine right and could not be removed or selected. When Sean suggests that Arthur's people were English lovers, he's likely referring to the fact that Jacobitism was strongest in Scotland, Wales and Ireland. In England it was a bit more limited, and mostly to the north. Arthur answers Sean's query with his own guess at his heritage.
My people were peasants. We had no time for politics.
In the Middle Ages, it said that 85% of the population of Europe could be described as peasants, so Arthur is probably right in this regard. Though in a historical sense, anyone who lived in the countryside was sometimes considered peasants, so this high percentage makes sense. In a different companion mission, Arthur goes fishing with Kieran, who talks about the fate of his parents.
I lost my mammy and pappy when I was young to cholera.
This is interesting. The only cholera outbreak in the United States that is close to matching up with Kieran's childhood or teenage years was the 4th outbreak in the late 1860s, and even that would be too early. The outbreak hit New York in April 1866, and by the middle of the year it had made its way inland, mostly due to the new railway networks. It's more likely then that Kieran's parents happened to catch a random bout of cholera unrelated to the mass pandemic. Even if the dates had matched up, the locations probably wouldn't. Kieran says that his family had dreams of moving west to California, but this outbreak never even got as far as the central United States. The outbreak before it did reach the west, however, around the year 1850. When it hit Nashville around 1849, it ended up killing former President James K. Polk just 3 months after leaving the White House. In another companion mission, Arthur goes fishing with Javier. There aren't really any historical connections to note, but still some interesting connections to real life that I thought were worth mentioning. On the way to the creek, Javier tells Arthur that he recently went fishing at the Lanahassee River. This river is likely based on the real-life Mississippi River, the second longest river in North America. Just as the Mississippi circles around New Orleans, the Lanahassee circles around Saint Denis. At the creek, Javier tells Arthur a little bit about the feeding schedule of the bluegill.
They feed early morning or late evening because that's when the insects are more likely to be out.
This is true. Bluegills are known to feed mostly during daylight hours, with the peak hours in the morning and evening. Even outside of strictly historical references, Rockstar is still on the ball with its accuracy. Back in the main story, Hosea talks about some of the gang's rivals.
Apparently, Cornwall's been pumping a lot of cash into the Pinkertons. Wants to keep their full effort on going after gangs. Gangs like us.
We already know this. As discussed before, E.H. Harriman, owner of the Union Pacific, hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to track down Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch after they robbed one of his trains. Impatient and desperate, he eventually raised the price on their heads from $1,000 to $10,000 each. It appears Cornwall may have done the same with the Vanderlyn gang here. In order to hide their identities in town, Hosea gives Arthur a nickname.
There! Fenton, there!
You might be interested to know that, by some counts, Fenton briefly entered the top 1,000 baby names around the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Arthur might not have even been the only Fenton in Rhodes on that day. In more recent years, the name tends to hover around number 10,000. Hosea probably wasn't the only Melvin either. The name tended to hover around the top 150, much higher than Fenton. Of course, Hosea gives Fenton some background too.
You're a clown's idiot brother.
The word idiot comes from the Greek noun meaning common man or a person lacking professional skill. Regarding the clinical definition of the word, we're a few years too early, but in 1908, Henry H. Goddard proposed a classification for intellectual disability based on an existing concept of mental age. In Goddard's system, an idiot is someone with a mental age of around 0 to 3 years, or an IQ of 0 to 25. The concept of mental age today, however, is outdated, and IQ is determined very differently, so idiot is now basically just an insult. At the saloon, Hosea explains their business.
We're in the new trade of advertising, which is an American art form about ensuring people buy the correct things.
While advertising certainly wasn't new in 1899, its status as an art form of sorts was somewhat recent, at least in more rural areas. In some format, advertising has existed for thousands of years. Egyptians wrote sales messages and wall posters, and the ruins of Pompeii and Arabia demonstrate commercial messages and political campaign displays. Modern advertising, though, began with the advent of magazines and newspapers in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the United States, the first advertising agency was established in Philadelphia around 1840, and the act of advertising dramatically increased after 1870, as demand for manufactured products increased. By 1900, there were an estimated 350,000 traveling men doing business in America. I guess Melvin and Fenton were two such men. In one of the more unique missions of Chapter 3, Sean says something interesting.
Just leave it to me. I can talk a dog off a meat wagon.
The meaning of this phrase is along the same lines as talk the hind leg off a donkey, as in to have the power to persuade someone to do something simply using speech. There are some alternatives to this, but the earliest printed example is in 1926, more than a quarter century after Sean's usage here. But again, informal phrases like this are very difficult to trace, so its usage here may very well be accurate. A little later in the mission, Sean makes some fire bottles. Now, the concept of fire bottles in some form dates to pre-modern history, but this exact concept doesn't appear until their invention in the 1930s. More specifically, they were first used in warfare in the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939, before they were given a name. That name, of course, is a Molotov cocktail, named as such by the Finnish during the Winter War in 1939. The name is a reference to the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, who declared on Soviet state radio that they were delivering airborne humanitarian food in Finland. In reality, they were actually dropping bombs. The reasoning for the name? The Finns wanted Molotov to have a drink to go with his food parcels. That being said, how Sean has conceived the idea of a fire bottle some 35 years before their first recorded use is beyond me. but they're pretty fun to use in game, so I think we're willing to let it slide. After the historical gold mine that was Valentine, it's a joy that Rockstar continue to treat us with the town of Rhodes and the state of Lemoyne, though a gold mine it may not prove to be, judging by the lack of wealth in the Greys and the Braithwaites. The Confederate States has a dark history, and Rockstar didn't shy away from telling some of these stories in Red Dead Redemption 2. But the stories certainly aren't over yet. We've got plenty of missions left in the game's 3rd chapter, with more Lemoyne Raiders to encounter, and more Confederate gold to go searching for.